Las Vegas, late night, end of the 1960s. A casino that doesn't appear in tourist brochures. Not the Sands, not the Flamingo. A place built for leverage, not applause. Where deals matter more than headlines. Dean Martin has just finished his set. No extra verses, no loose jokes, no leaning into the room. He hit the final note exactly where the clock told him to. Backstage is quiet, in a way performers notice immediately. Too orderly, too clean. The kind of quiet that doesn't come from professionalism, but from instruction. Dean takes the staff corridor instead of the main exit. Habit. Fewer eyes. Less noise. Halfway down the hall, two security men step into his path. Not rough, not threatening. Polite enough to be dangerous. One of them gestures subtly, not blocking him, redirecting him. As if the idea of leaving has simply been postponed. Then the owner appears. No entourage, no ring, no visible symbols of power. Just a man whose authority doesn't need rehearsal. A man whose name is never printed because it doesn't need to be. He speaks quietly, almost conversationally, like he's commenting on the weather. Dean, you're not walking out tonight. The words don't echo. They don't need to. There's a pause. Long enough for the security guards to shift their weight. Long enough for the corridor to feel narrower than it did a moment ago. Dean looks at the man. Really looks at him. Then he smiles. Not nervously. Not defiantly. Not the smile from the stage. It's the smile of someone who already understands how this ends, and knows the other man doesn't. A decision has been made. The only question left is by whom. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. Las Vegas never really slept, but there were rooms where it learned how to whisper. The suite was one of them. High floor. Curtains drawn tight despite the glow outside. No music, no clinking ice, no laughter bleeding through thin walls. Just a low table, 3 chairs, and the kind of silence that suggested decisions had already been made before anyone sat down. Dean Martin arrived last, not late. Deliberately last. His jacket stayed on. He didn't loosen his tie. That alone felt wrong. People were used to him entering rooms like this, already smiling, already halfway into a joke, already carrying the weight of the night lightly, as if none of it could ever truly touch him. Tonight, he carried nothing at all. One man stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. Another sat, legs crossed, studying the rim of an empty glass, as if it might offer guidance. No assistance, no security, no witnesses who could be quoted later. This wasn't a meeting. It was a conclusion. They didn't ask Dean how the show went. They didn't compliment the crowd or the turnout or the applause that had shaken the walls downstairs less than an hour earlier. That applause still existed in the building, still vibrated faintly through the floors. But it had no place here. The man by the window turned first. His voice was calm, measured, almost courteous. "We don't need you." It wasn't delivered like an insult. No edge, no anger. It sounded administrative, like a line item being crossed out. As if Dean Martin were a schedule adjustment, not a person. No explanation followed. None was expected. In rooms like this, reasons were liabilities. Control worked better when it stayed abstract, when it didn't have to justify itself. Dean didn't blink. He didn't shift his weight. For a moment, it wasn't even clear if he'd heard the words. Silence stretched, thin and deliberate. 5 seconds. Then 10. The seated man glanced up, irritation flickering across his face. This wasn't how these conversations usually went. There was supposed to be protest, or at least confusion. Some attempt to negotiate the terms of erasure. Dean offered none of it. His expression didn't harden. It didn't soften either. It simply settled, like something finally aligning internally. He looked at the speaker, then briefly at the other man, as if committing the arrangement of the room to memory. Not faces, positions. Someone cleared their throat, the smallest sign of discomfort. Dean still said nothing. In another context, that silence might have read as shock, or fear, or a man realizing he'd just lost something essential. But one of them, the one who hadn't spoken yet, noticed something else. Dean's hands were steady, his breathing slow. There was no scramble behind his eyes, no search for footing. This wasn't collapse. It was restraint. Dean reached down, picked up his coat from the back of the chair, and folded it once over his arm. The movement was unhurried, almost polite. He nodded. Not in agreement, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. The way you nod when someone has revealed more than they intended. Then he turned toward the door. "That's it?" the seated man asked, sharper now. The breach of etiquette slipped out before he could stop it. Dean paused with his hand on the handle. For half a second, it seemed possible he might turn back. Say something memorable. Something that could be repeated, misquoted, mythologized. He didn't. He opened the door and left the room unfinished. Behind him, the silence changed shape. It was no longer controlled. It sprawled. No one spoke for several seconds, each man privately recalculating what had just happened. Down the hall, Dean walked alone, the muffled sounds of the casino rising again as he moved farther from the suite. Laughter. Music. A different world, still spinning. Before he reached the elevator, the phone in the suite rang. By the time Dean stepped into the night air outside, someone else was already on another line, calling a booking office, adjusting a schedule, making sure the change felt gradual. Quiet. Reasonable. Erasure, done properly, was never loud. Dean didn't look back at the building. He didn't need to. What lingered wasn't the sentence he'd been given, but the fact that he'd refused to complete it. The changes didn't arrive with announcements. No letters, no phone calls that could be quoted or remembered clearly. They appeared the way pressure does, gradually, quietly, until the air felt different, and you couldn't point to the moment it happened. Dean noticed the first one without reacting. A Thursday night slot that used to sell out by habit was moved. Not cancelled, just shifted later, tucked between acts that didn't belong together. The room was the same size, the marquee unchanged, but the energy wasn't. The crowd came slower. Applause arrived late, like it was checking the room before committing. He told himself it was nothing. The second time, there was no warm-up act, no introduction with flourish, just a clipped announcement and a spotlight that felt less curious, more procedural. He performed anyway. Same control, same timing. But something was missing. Not from him, from the space around him. A cooling. No one explained it. That was the point. By the third week, patterns emerged. Advertising budgets that had always been reliable seemed to evaporate. His name appeared smaller on shared posters. A hotel manager who used to greet him by name now nodded from a distance, polite and careful, like someone afraid of being seen too close. Dean didn't confront anyone. He didn't ask questions that would force lies into the open. He watched. He listened to what wasn't said. The system worked best when everyone pretended it wasn't a system. A former booking agent crossed paths with him backstage one night and spoke about the weather too long. Another promised to circle back, and never did. People smiled, but their smiles ended early, cutting off before the eyes had time to follow. That was when a young promoter found him near the service corridor. Not one of the established men, not someone with leverage to lose. Nervous hands, fast speech. "This isn't random," he said quietly, glancing around. "They're thinning you out, making it inconvenient to stay." Dean studied him for a moment, then nodded once, not in surprise, in confirmation. The promoter hesitated. "It doesn't have to get worse," he added. "There's talk of a new deal, clean, profitable." The proposal came 2 days later, formal, generous on paper. Fewer nights, less control over content, scripts reviewed, no unscheduled remarks. A version of Dean Martin that fit more neatly into other people's plans. No one framed it as a demotion. It was presented as efficiency. Dean read it once. He didn't mark it up. He didn't counter. He folded the pages and handed them back, calm as if returning a menu. "No," he said. "Just that." The silence on the other end of the table stretched, confused now. They'd expected negotiation, a pause at least, something to manage. Instead, Dean stood, thanked them for their time, and left. That night, he played to a half-full room. The acoustics were wrong, the audience polite but distant. He adjusted without effort, finishing precisely on time, refusing to overreach. When it was done, he didn't linger. No encore, no wave. Back in his hotel room, he sat with the lights off, the city flickering beyond the glass. The anger came late, brief and sharp, then passed. What remained wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. They weren't pushing him out. They were waiting for him to bend. Dean reached for the phone, not to call anyone who could fix this, but to take notes. Names, dates, patterns. If this was how they erased people, he wanted to understand every step of it. And if silence had started this, silence would decide what came next. By the time people in Las Vegas began asking where Dean Martin had gone, he was already somewhere else, deliberately unreachable. No farewell shows, no explanations offered to columnists. His name simply stopped appearing where it was expected, and absence in that city always invited speculation. Some said it was exhaustion. Others leaned on old, lazy assumptions: drinking, unreliability, decline. A few suggested he'd finally been pushed too far and had gone to ground. None of them were right. Dean chose places where nobody watched him arrive, studios that didn't feel glamorous, offices without photographs on the walls, rooms where people listened more than they talked. He dressed plainly, moved quietly, and let others underestimate how much he was paying attention. While Vegas kept adjusting schedules without him, Dean was recording, not chasing hits, but preserving control. Sessions were efficient. No wasted takes, no excess sentiment. He worked with musicians who showed up prepared and left without stories to sell. It wasn't nostalgia he was after. It was leverage that didn't need approval. At the same time, conversations were happening that didn't pass through the usual gates. Television executives who cared about ratings more than hierarchies returned his calls. They spoke in numbers, not loyalties, evening slots, households, consistency. Dean listened, asked precise questions, made no promises he couldn't keep. What surprised them wasn't his ambition. It was his lack of need. He didn't ask to be positioned against anyone. He didn't want framing or context. He wanted space, ownership of tone, and the right to walk away when it no longer felt honest. That alone changed the dynamic. The format he agreed to wasn't revolutionary, just clean. A setting where his presence carried the weight, not the spectacle around it. No rat pack machinery, no shared billing to negotiate egos. Just him, the audience at home, and the distance that television allowed, enough to breathe. When the press noticed, it was already done. Announcements appeared without build-up. A new arrangement, a familiar name, oddly independent. Articles speculated about reconciliations that hadn't happened, alliances that didn't exist. Inside Vegas, the news traveled differently. One of the men who had helped engineer Dean's quiet sidelining learned about the deal over breakfast. Newspaper folded open beside untouched coffee. There was no warning call, no courtesy heads up, just confirmation that something had shifted without permission. The phrase from that closed suite, the one meant to settle things, resurfaced in his mind, stripped of confidence. "We don't need you." It sounded thinner now, less final. Dean, for his part, didn't comment. He didn't correct the stories or deny the rumors. Publicly, he remained silent. Privately, he worked more than he had in years, not frantically, not defensively, but with intent. He wasn't proving anything. He was removing dependencies. Weeks passed. Then months. The distance became its own statement. He hadn't vanished. He had relocated power, quietly, to places where it couldn't be withdrawn on a whim. And somewhere between broadcasts and recordings, between calm meetings and finished work, it became clear. The game hadn't ended. He had simply stopped playing the one they controlled. Las Vegas adapted quickly. It always had. New names rotated onto marquees. Younger faces filled the bars after shows. And the sound in the rooms shifted. Louder, faster, less patient. On the surface, nothing seemed broken. Yet beneath the noise, something familiar was missing. And people noticed it not all at once, but in fragments. It started with numbers. A midweek report crossed a casino executive's desk, showing a dip in ticket sales that couldn't be explained by weather or competition. The data didn't accuse anyone. It simply pointed to a pattern. Nights that once depended on a certain presence no longer carried themselves. The room still filled, technically, but later. Drinks sold slower. Guests left earlier. The energy flattened sooner than it used to. No one said Dean Martin's name out loud at first. It felt unnecessary, even impolite, like admitting you'd misjudged something fundamental. At the same time, televisions across the country began to glow with something steadier. Living rooms replaced lounges. Families who had never set foot in a Vegas showroom now arranged their evenings around a familiar voice and an ease that felt unforced. There was no swagger to it, no attempt to dominate the frame. Just a man comfortable enough to let silence work between lines. The contrast unsettled people. Vegas had always believed it was the center, that everything meaningful eventually bent back toward its lights. But television didn't need geography. It rewarded consistency, not allegiance. And Dean fitted in a way that surprised those who had assumed he belonged to the old order only. Back on the Strip, younger performers borrowed pieces of him openly. The relaxed phrasing, the offhand timing, the illusion that nothing was rehearsed. They wore the style earnestly, but something essential failed to transfer. Without the distance, without the self-control beneath it, the imitation felt exposed. Audiences laughed, but they didn't lean in. A veteran stage manager said it first, quietly, over a late drink. "He made this look easier than it was," he admitted. "We thought it was the room doing the work." Others began to agree. Not nostalgically, practically. They realized that Dean hadn't been filling time. He'd been setting tone. Without him, the rooms felt louder, but less anchored. Dean didn't comment on any of it. From his side, there was no sense of victory. No satisfaction in watching an old system strain. He didn't return calls that carried vague apologies disguised as updates. He didn't ask for reconsideration. He simply kept doing what worked, where it worked. And that refusal to circle back was what unsettled them most. They had assumed absence would weaken him. Instead, it redistributed attention. His name no longer needed neon to be visible. It traveled through ratings sheets, casual conversations, routines people built into their evenings. Someone finally said it plainly during a closed meeting, not as accusation, but acknowledgement. "He didn't get pushed out," the voice said. "He stepped away." The room went quiet, not because the statement was dramatic, but because it clarified something uncomfortable. Control had been mistaken for leverage, familiarity for ownership. Outside, the city kept flashing, adjusting, promising novelty. Inside, a realization settled slowly and without ceremony. Dean Martin hadn't left a gap. He'd revealed one. The message didn't come directly. It never would have. Pride required distance, and distance required intermediaries. It arrived first as a suggestion passed through a manager who no longer managed him. Then as a comment delivered casually at a charity event by someone who insisted they were just relaying a thought. Nothing formal. Nothing that could be pointed to later and labeled a concession. The language was careful. Things could be smoothed over. There was no reason to let old misunderstandings linger. People were willing to be flexible. Dean listened to each version without interrupting. He didn't react when names were mentioned or when the past was framed as an inconvenience rather than a decision. He thanked everyone for the concern, then changed the subject. Not evasively, decisively. As if the conversation had reached its natural end. By the middle of the decade, the signals grew more specific. A shared appearance was floated. Not billed as a reunion. Not explained. Just two names placed near each other in a way that would draw attention without inviting questions. Television producers liked the idea. Sponsors liked it more. No one used the word apology. The offer came with assurances, no pressure, no scripts. Everything handled the way it used to be. The phrase lingered longer than intended, exposing the wish beneath it. Restoration, not reconciliation. Dean considered it longer than people expected. When he agreed, it wasn't enthusiasm that surprised them. It was the absence of conditions, until there was one. A single request, delivered quietly, not written down. Something so understated it felt almost symbolic. Those who heard it understood immediately why it couldn't be negotiated publicly. They accepted. On the day of the meeting, Dean arrived early. Not for effect, for control. The room was neutral, borrowed, stripped of history. He chose his seat deliberately, not facing anyone, not presenting himself, waiting. When the others entered, conversation started around him, tentative and polite. References to schedules, shared acquaintances, the kind of talk designed to bridge space without crossing it. Dean nodded when appropriate. He didn't fill gaps. Eventually, someone addressed the past indirectly, circling the moment without touching it. Dean let the words land and remain where they fell. He didn't correct them. The imbalance was subtle, but undeniable. The people who had once set terms now found themselves reacting, adjusting tone, reading his silence for cues. The power hadn't shifted loudly. It had tilted. Dean never raised his voice, never asserted anything outright. He didn't need to. His presence alone set limits. What would be discussed? What wouldn't? How far anyone could go without invitation. By the time the meeting ended, there was relief in the room, not satisfaction. The sense that something dangerous had been avoided, though no one could quite say what. As Dean stood to leave, one of them almost said it, almost reached for a phrase that might have closed the circle. Dean picked up his coat. He smiled, not warmly, not coldly, with distance. Whatever this was, it would move forward on his terms now. And if it didn't, he was already elsewhere. The real reckoning, he knew, wouldn't happen here. It would happen where silence had an audience. The stage lights were softer than they used to be. Not dimmer, controlled. Television light, designed to forgive age, to flatten sharp edges, to hold faces steady under scrutiny. The audience filled the studio in careful rows, applause rehearsed just enough to sound spontaneous. Everyone knew what night it was, even if no one had said why. Dean arrived without announcement. No escort. No pause at the curtain. He took his place as if this were routine, as if years of distance hadn't led to this exact geometry of space and attention. Across from him, not quite opposite but close enough to register, sat the man whose words had once ended a chapter without discussion. The producers pretended it was coincidence. Cameras rolled. Jokes landed. Music carried the early minutes forward with practiced ease. To anyone watching casually, it looked like another polished broadcast. Competent, nostalgic, safe. But under the surface, everyone was waiting for the same thing. A line, a glance. Something that would acknowledge the history humming just beneath the script. Behind the cameras, crew members slowed their movements. Sound engineers leaned closer to their boards. A director raised a hand once, then lowered it, deciding not to intervene. This wasn't something you could cue. Dean felt the moment approaching before it arrived. Years on stage had trained him to sense shifts, not in volume, but in expectation. The host turned toward him with an opening that hadn't been rehearsed. A pause, wide enough to invite anything. This was it. The space where a response belonged. The audience quieted instinctively. Not silence yet. Anticipation. The kind that tightens the air. Somewhere, someone exhaled too loudly, and then stopped breathing altogether. Dean smiled. Not the broad grin people remembered from photographs. Something smaller. Controlled. He leaned forward slightly, as if to speak, and the stillness deepened. Every version of the past seemed to hover there, waiting to be shaped into a sentence. Instead, Dean turned his head, not away, but aside. He gestured lightly toward the band. A comment followed, effortless, redirecting attention. A gracious acknowledgement of someone else's work. A compliment that carried no subtext, no edge. Laughter returned, hesitant at first, then full. The moment closed without confrontation, without release. Cameras adjusted. The show moved on. Across from him, the man who had once spoken so definitively didn't hide his reaction well enough. Confusion flickered, then something closer to recognition. Not relief. Understanding. Dean hadn't missed the opportunity. He'd declined it. For the rest of the broadcast, Dean remained exactly what he appeared to be. Present, professional, unreachable. He didn't dominate the frame. He didn't withdraw from it either. He existed on his own axis, impossible to pull into alignment with anyone else's narrative. When the final applause faded and the red lights went dark, people spoke at once. Interpretations formed immediately, competing for authority. Some called it class, others restraint. A few insisted it was avoidance. Dean didn't clarify. Backstage, he thanked the crew, exchanged brief handshakes, and left before conversations could congeal into questions. No statement followed. No explanation was offered later. The silence remained intact, untouched by commentary. And in that restraint, something settled. Those who had waited years for him to answer finally understood. Any reply would have belonged to the past. Any defense would have accepted the frame he'd been given long ago. By saying nothing, again, Dean had spoken precisely where it mattered. Not to the room, to time itself. The morning after the broadcast arrived without urgency. No emergency calls, no headlines that settled on a single meaning, just speculation spreading at different speeds, each version confident in its own logic. Some columnists framed the moment as reconciliation. Others called it restraint, polished into performance. A few sensed something colder, a refusal disguised as charm. None of them agreed, and that disagreement was the point. Dean didn't read any of it. He spent the day the way he often did now. Unannounced lunch, a short walk, a quiet afternoon. No victory to savor. No wound reopened. What had mattered was already behind him, and it hadn't required witnesses. The questions found him anyway, through people who thought they were being subtle. Do you think it's finally settled? Was that your answer? Did you feel tempted, even for a second? Dean listened, smiled faintly, and redirected the conversation every time. Not evasively, deliberately. He understood something most of them didn't. Answers freeze moments in place. Silence lets them mature. Days later, a producer repeated a rumor to someone close to Dean, hoping it might circle back. The rumor claimed Dean had planned the silence for years, that it was strategy sharpened into spectacle. The truth was quieter. The person who heard it shook their head and corrected him gently. He didn't answer because answering would have meant accepting the moment as it was offered, they said. And that moment wasn't his. That explanation traveled slowly. It didn't fit into headlines or airtime. But for those who understood the machinery of power, how it invites reaction, how it feeds on acknowledgement, it landed with precision. Dean hadn't been afraid to speak. He'd refused to shrink his years into a sentence. Looking back, the phrase that had started everything sounded smaller than it once had. Not cruel, not dramatic, just short-sighted. A declaration made by people who believed influence was permanent and silence was empty. Time proved otherwise. Dean's reputation didn't harden into legend or soften into nostalgia. It remained intact because he hadn't defended it. He let it rest on consistency, on choices repeated quietly over decades, on the discipline to leave rooms unfinished when they demanded too much. There was no final meeting, no private closure. None was needed. The distance stayed respectful. The past remained uncorrected. And in that unresolved space, something honest survived. Years later, when people spoke about him, they rarely mentioned the night of the silence directly. They spoke instead about how he carried himself afterward, about how he never chased relevance, yet never lost it, about how he seemed untouched by the need to settle scores. The last thing the story left behind wasn't a line anyone could quote. It was a feeling. The weight of a man who understood that dignity doesn't argue, doesn't explain, and doesn't arrive on cue. And the lingering question, impossible to answer quickly, when the moment comes, would you know when not to speak?